There we go. Over here, on your left. There we go. If we're still blurry, double check your settings and make sure they're at 4K on your playback. Otherwise, it'll just be kind of annoying.
We need to start by apologizing. We're both from New Hampshire, and so if our accents get in the way, we apologize for that.
And this is just a regular discussion. Hi, I'm Major Corindia around here at AU. I go by Lieutenant Dan. I'm joined by Dr. Coyote Smith of the Space Department here at AU. And I just wanted to bring you in on a discussion that we get to have around here. Coyote started in 2017. He published through War on the Rocks an article called America Needs a Space Corps. I've included it in the link in the description below. But I wanted to sit down with you and actually bring our students in so they could get almost firsthand exposed to the discussions we have around here. So in short, why does America need a Space Corps?
America needs a Space Corps for exactly the same reason America needed an Air Corps back during the interwar years. There's a problem that airmen faced in the interwar years, and it led to the establishment of the Air Corps. And that problem was that, they were working for the Army. And the Army had their view about how things should be done, how things should be talked about. They had a complete perspective that was different than the airman's mindset. And airmen realized that they needed to have greater independence and autonomy, especially over their own budget, so they could have program consistency from year to year, because developing science and technology is a long-term investment. And they also needed to have a repository, an organization, where people could develop specific expertise related to air and air operations. And that's exactly the situation that we're facing today. Right now, I assess the overall education and training that the Air Force provides its space professionals, my opinion only, as exceedingly poor. The current...
Well, you could say this. This is an academic environment.
Yes. I say it's poor. And I reference that to a statement made by Dr. Scott Pace, who right now is the Executive Secretary of the National Space Council, who said a few years ago, when Air Force personnel, space personnel, separate from the Air Force, they need not even bother sending their resumes to NASA or to industry, because in NASA and industry's mindset, they're not qualified to do space. At least not in the ways that NASA and industry are doing them. Now, I'll say that many people do get hired by industry, but they're typically in government relations or government acquisitions, those types of things, not really doing the hard science to actually make space happen.
Okay, so I'm hearing that we need to separate, or in your mind, we need to separate, and it's kind of long overdue. So we went from the excitement of the 1960s and early 70s.
Yeah.
I'm a kid of watching the Challenger blow up in front of our eyes and knowing that one of our own teachers was up there. And I know it's been noted that that's possibly a hindrance to the excitement of America going into space. But so you think this change is long overdue to break off into a Space Corps?
I sure do. There's an old saying that when you need trees, the best time to plant a forest was 100 years ago.
Yes.
The next best time is right now. And it's been long over indicated that we needed to have greater autonomy for our space forces, going way back about 30 years ago. 25 years ago, I was the counter space instructor at the Air Force Weapons School, and I was really feeling the pinch of trying to integrate our space capabilities into overall Air Force schema of operations. And I was being prevented by classification barriers. Something as simple as the idea of space as a sanctuary. It never was a sanctuary. That's a political narrative that the diplomatic community has continued to push, but it's simply not true. Space has been a contested domain for a long time. I'm glad that we are now stepping out and finally talking about that, because it will improve the overall quality of discussion. It's absolutely essential that hopefully our students who are interested in space will do research and publish themselves on space-related topics. I started back in 1997 when I was at the weapons school working with my senator, Bob Smith from New Hampshire. And he became an advocate for an independent space force. He wanted an independent space force because in his mind, Congress simply takes the budget and they divide it equally amongst the services. Navy gets a little plus up for the Marine Corps. But what he thought would happen is by splitting the budget between the Army and Navy, Air Force, and a Space Force, space would become fully funded, The Air Force would actually save money in that relationship, and the Army and Navy budget would go to contribute to the establishment of the Space Force. He felt that because the Air Force was arguing at that time that we needed aerospace integration, that if you had a separate Space Force, air and space together would get about half the Department of Defense budget. That would be quite sizable. And if you take a look at coming off the success that we had in Desert Storm and working towards fifth generation aircraft, that would have played to the Air Force's benefit. Plus, we would have already established an independent organization that had space superiority as its primary role and mission, not as a necessary thing that a support element needs to do further down the line. We have a constant problem that space programs never rise above the line in any great numbers, or not sufficiently, for us to actually achieve most of the goals that we have. In 1964, by 1964, we were already performing on orbit virtually every mission that we're doing today. All we've done is added new, better capabilities and new satellite systems, but communications, weather, position navigation and timing, on-orbit space surveillance, reconnaissance, etc. All of those functions were being done by 64, and we have not moved off the 1964 template of the things that our Air Force is doing in space. We need to have a robust defense. We need to have robust offensive capabilities. We also need to expand our roles and missions to provide support and services to those commercial spacefaring entities that are up there. A tremendous portion of our national economy hangs on space capabilities, and we're not doing an adequate job defending them. We're not even doing an adequate job defending our own military capabilities upon which we defend. One of the perspectives is very different between air power and space power. Airmen fight wars, or train to fight wars, and write doctrine about war fighting. And they give that to us space professionals. The problem is, the world's a very big place, and our space systems are 24/7, 365-day operation, providing capabilities all the time. None of our satellites sit fallow. When they aren't working for the military, they're working for commerce. They're working for the national economy. They're doing all kinds of different things that are just not in the airman's mindset. It's always Burger King at rush hour in a space squadron because there's always so much going on. When we do go to war, it's in a small place on the relative map of the globe. But I have constellations that I have to provide continuous global capabilities, and those satellites require almost constant massaging and proper tasking in order to bring down those capabilities, not just for air power or the joint force, but for the full national instruments of power, your diplomacy, your informational, your military, and of course your economic. And so when we talk multi-domain operations, we're already talking about a concept that's too small for space, because space has multiple instruments of power operations continuously and globally.
So why not just jump to a Space Force then?
Well, it's like the second paragraph of my article, America Needs a U.S. Space Corps, stated, moving too fast to the goal could actually cause more harm. You could have programs that become disconnected. There's going to be things that would fall between the cracks. This is not something that needs to be rushed. I do believe that the establishment of a Space Corps under the Air Force is a prudent first step to actually giving space professionals greater autonomy over their career field, greater autonomy over their budget and program assignments, and also to allow them to establish separate and independent space power theory and doctrine and strategy. All of those are absolutely necessary. Right now, we're not getting the job done. Whenever we have an opportunity to teach space professionals about space, we're teaching them air power instead. It's kind of like, I love this analogy, Pete Gerritsen uses this analogy. He says, suppose you have a high school and your complete athletics program is focused around your football team. And the football team's much like the Air Force. The only problem is you want to play in other sports. You want to play in volleyball, baseball, soccer. But everybody has to go to football practice. And you just show up on game time when you go play volleyball, or baseball, or soccer. And your training really hasn't prepared you to maximize your performance in those other sports. You've been maximized as a football player. And that's what we've done with our space professionals inside the Air Force, in my opinion.
So far, by following the Army Air Corps model, proposing we separate the Space Forces off and make them their own entity inside the Air Force as an Air Corps, kind of like the Army did with the Air Corps. And then eventually growing into the Air Force, and eventually maybe going into the Space Force or Star Force, depending on how you want to actually use that phrase. You think that's a step in the right direction?
I do think it's a step in the right direction. One thing we have to do is break the airman's mindset amongst our space professionals. They first and foremost need to know space. They need to know how to operate there. They need to know the unique conditions that obtain in space. They also need to know what the potential is. They need to be advocates for pushing for the economic development of space. As a nation that's sitting here looking at a national deficit of nearly $22 trillion, we need to find new horizons, new places to go to get resources in order to eliminate that tremendous debt. One of the things that we've advocated for vociferously is space-based solar power. Back in 2006, I advocated for space-based solar power with the Space-Based Solar Power Study Group that we assembled on the Pentagon. We had no budget for the study, so I went to the open internet and we crowdsourced. It was the first crowdsourced study. We didn't even have the term crowdsourcing at the time. And we put together this study with 207 volunteers, some of the best legal, engineering, scientific minds in the country, to develop space-based solar power, to put solar panels, huge solar panels in outer space and broadcast that energy safely and cleanly to Earth, where it can be incorporated into the electrical power grid. Such a thing can wean us off carbon-contaminating fossil fuels, etc., which many people attribute to climate change and global warming. We think that there is an economic incentive that the United States could become the Saudi Arabia of safe, clean energy, selling that energy to the rest of the world, and being able to buy down our national debt with that type of capability.
So I'm hearing part of this that is, I think, a key in your article that you stated. So this really comes down to it's a money thing right now.
You know, it's more than a money thing. You know, there's been a lot of cynicism out there between the air and the space community. There's a long-standing joke. I began one of my other articles with it. Roger DeCook, the late Vice Commander of Air Force Space Command, said famously, you know, we say air and space so we can do air and forget space. Our Air Force has a priority. Its primary mission is air power. No airman deserves a poke in the eye with a sharp stick over mismanagement of space, etc. Their primary job is taking care of air power, and they will trade off secondary and third order missions in order to give emphasis to the primary mission. I would do the same thing. You would do the same thing, and so our leaders have done that. It's just we're making an argument here that it's time. We have got such national and international dependencies on our space systems. We've made our allies dependent on our space systems, and we're not doing enough to defend them. We have not thought about space superiority. We have not even broached the subject of how we're going to expand our roles and missions to provide Coast Guard-like services to our commercial spacefaring entities out there, as we see space tourism kicking off, as we see Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk talking about settling the moon, settling Mars. We need to start now to build a space force through a space corps that will address these problems. We don't need massive investments in it now. We need a lot of thinking about it. Who's going to provide law enforcement in space? It's not going to be NASA. We need to have an element of whatever space becomes that will provide space law enforcement. Other things such as search and rescue, safety of flight inspections, on-orbit inspections. All of these are part and parcel of the vision that we have for expanding the roles and missions of space that are beyond the Air Force's ability to elaborate beyond its constrained role and mission of warfighting.
So say next week you're told, start a Space Corps. How would you do that?
There's one of two ways that people have proposed. People have proposed that you stand it up, you immediately abscond with the forces of the other services, and you formulate a space corps that way. That's viable. You could do that. It would be a tremendous savings. The other thing is that you leave those services in place, you leave the space forces in the other services, and you stand up a separate entity that starts working those long-range views and goals, etc. And as the time indicates, you start absconding with the forces of the other services when needed. Both of those methods are actually viable. I have not assessed either one of those with sufficient detail to tell you which one is better, numerically speaking. I will tell you what my preference is. I do think we need to stand up a space force a Space Corps inside the Air Force soonest. I think we need to probably limit the Army and the Navy and the Air Force eventually, over time, to 1,000 people in their services space MAGCOM equivalent. That way, those services will concentrate on establishing requirements for the Space Force, working theater integration with space capabilities, and also user equipment for their people in their particular domains to have the equipment to operate successfully with space-enabled services.
So we're almost at the end of the time. And welcome back. Sorry about that. We have discovered that our camera here will overheat and automatically shut off. But we are coming up, Coyote, to the final question.
Okay.
So the last question is, why should American and the American public in general be concerned about maintaining the lead in space? And really, why aren't we still in the lead?
You know, that's a very good question. The American public should be exceptionally concerned. Over the years, we have become dependent on space for such things as electrical power distribution, water pumping, circulation of all different kinds of...
How?
You know, we use the GPS timing signal. The GPS timing signal is used to synchronize and harmonize motor generators at power generation plants so that we can maximize the power output. We do the same thing through the distribution system of electricity and through the distribution system of like city water systems that provide water. We even meter the water using GPS. But my point here is if we lose GPS, we'll lose our electrical power grid through over-demand. We have not built nearly enough power generation plants to keep up with the demand, just based on standard power generation and broadcasting. But when you integrate GPS, you can maximize the power generation and output distribution. And so that's what we've done to keep pace with the increasing demand. But as you see, like out in California and West Coast areas, we're really pushing against the seams. We have rolling blackouts and grayouts in several of those communities during high demand power times. And just imagine what would happen if somebody messed with our GPS constellation and put down GPS. It wouldn't just have a very profound effect on our ability to project military power, but it would also impact our economy immediately.
So you wouldn't just see, now I have to figure out my own way across Montgomery, or the cell phone signals are no longer synchronized so you can't make any phone calls. It's much more in depth than that.
It's much more in depth than that. If you like electricity, you like GPS. And the other part of that story is that our allies have also become increasingly dependent on our space capabilities. We're going to have to protect and defend those. Now, you raised the point, America losing its lead in space. Yeah, a hard-charging China and a resurgent Russia now are increasingly collaborating, as our National Intelligence Director put out a report in January of this year. And in December of last year, NASIC put out a report showing that Russia and China are increasingly collaborating, that they have a closer alliance than what we had previously anticipated. Okay. And if you take a look at their space programs in particular, you see the Chinese are dominating the low Earth orbit and mid-Earth orbit. Meanwhile, the Russians are dominating the mid-Earth orbit up to the geostationary belt. And so they basically have built compatible and complementary space programs. Now, individually, those countries will step up to the diplomatic microphone at the United Nations and will say that each of them have small space programs. They can't compete against the United States. Well, when you put them together, they can. And then when you take a look also at the counter space weaponry that they have fielded across many different categories of types of counter space weapons, they are healthy and robust in that field. Every time we put up a satellite, they're rolling out units designed to take those satellites out. They have got the ability to do what was reported in the 1990s. Two colonels, Chinese colonels, published a doctrine that talked about de-informationalizing American way of warfare, and that was how they could gain an advantage. And so they have a very concerted cyber and counter space weaponry aimed at our space systems. And those can have some very profound effects on us. Meanwhile, we've been distracted, quite literally, by wars in the Middle East over the last going on 2 decades now. And that introduced a strategic pause where we stopped doing the heavy science, where we stop doing the other types of things to advance our military space pedigree. But the Russians and the Chinese have taken advantage of that pause, and they now have their industries fully assembled and cranking out capabilities against us. And it's no secret that we have stumbled with our acquisition programs here in the United States. Things are taking way too long. It's hard for us to actually go from conception to fielding a system. We have some sense that during the process of our conceptualizing a system, that the Russians and the Chinese are absconding with those ideas and building the systems before we actually get to them. And meanwhile, we have people in Washington, D.C. who are trying to convince our political mechanism that, well, creating a space force or a space corps would be destabilizing. Oh, but the Russian and Chinese weapons are not. So we've got some serious challenges ahead of us. Members of Congress have taken this on. Congressman Mike Rogers, my representative from here in the state of Alabama, was the big voice that picked up the paper, America Needs a U.S. Space Corps, and championed it in 2017. His ranking member at that time, who is now the chair of the Strategic Forces Subcommittee, is Jim Cooper. And we've seen that as the Adam Smith, who is the current chair of the House Armed Services Committee, has pushed back on the establishment of what he refers to as President Trump's Space Force and asked for a cheaper, low-cost solution. He's given the paperwork back to Congressman Rogers and Cooper to actually redraft the legislation. We hope that that comes forward and gives space everything that the airmen were looking for with the establishment of a Space Corps. If you read DeWitt Kopp's book, A Few Great Captains, he will actually say in there, Jimmy Doolittle was the vociferous advocate for greater autonomy of personnel, greater autonomy over budget and assignments and promotions, etc., in order to advance the training and education of air professionals so that they could form eventually the United States Air Force. And we are at that same point in space right now. The Rumsfeld Commission 20 years ago suggested that the time was right for a Space Force, but we did not act on that because we got distracted by the attack on 9/11. I personally believe that if the 9/11 attack had not occurred, we'd probably have a Space Force today, having evolved it over the course of probably 10 years as a Space Corps to that ultimate conclusion.
All right. Well, we're just about out of time here. Dr. Smith, I want to thank you for letting me come into your office, and thank you to letting our students come in as well. If you like what you saw here, make comments in the bottom. The link for his paper will also be down there as well. And if you want to see more things like this coming out of AU, just let us know. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. Take care.
And thank you.